I remember how a loud pounding on the door woke me up. I opened my eyes and instantly felt a sharp jolt in my chest from fear, because I knew my father was behind that door, and he was clearly in a foul mood. He told me to get up immediately and never dare oversleep my morning chores again. I threw off the blanket and sat on the bed, glancing around in the half-darkness. Anxiety washed over me from head to toe, like I was a small child again who had failed to fulfill my father's command and now was bracing for the punishment he deemed appropriate. That was how my morning began. My father was the kind of man who considered himself an unquestionable authority. His word was law, and no one else's opinion mattered. For as long as I can remember, I always tried to read his face to see what mood he was in, if something had gone wrong for him. If I sensed even a hint of anger, it was better not to be around. Sometimes I thought he took pleasure in making me feel guilty for things I never actually did. He was that type who could turn the smallest oversight, like spilling tea on the tablecloth, into a huge tragedy worthy of loud rebukes and angry lectures. My mother lived beside him, but her voice was almost never heard in the house. She had grown used to him making every decision. Once upon a time, she tried to speak up, to stop him, but he reminded her who was in charge here. After that, she mostly stayed silent. Sometimes I thought she was just as much a victim of his tyranny as I was, because he knew how to make a person feel worthless if they didn't acknowledge his superiority. I tried to imagine what it was like for her to share a life with someone like that for years, but I had no answers. I suspected she had lost any hope of living without fear and simply yielded to it. Besides my parents, I had an older brother, Stas, and a younger sister, Mila. If father was the main source of tension, my brother reinforced that atmosphere with his actions, while my sister seemed to dream of escaping, staying distant from it all. Stas often behaved defiantly. He told everyone he wouldn't put up with father, but whenever he ran into trouble, like needing money or someone to bail him out, he ran back to father and said father was the reason his life was such a mess, so father should fix it. Father would rage and scold him, yet somehow Stas still got what he wanted from time to time. Sometimes he even stole money from me or grabbed something of mine whenever he needed it. Mila grew up a very quiet girl who would stare helplessly when fights broke out in the house. She usually avoided conflicts, shutting herself in her room and pretending she was busy studying. I felt sorry for her, realizing she had learned early that showing emotion risked father's wrath. And still, I noticed that sometimes she acted surreptitiously to get something for herself. She might say she needed money for extra lessons and ask mother for it, only to spend it on something else she never mentioned at home. That was also a form of survival. It seemed that each of us had our own strategy for enduring this family life. As I got older, I understood how steeped in poison our family truly was. Father didn't just give orders. He enjoyed pitting us against each other so he could act as judge. If a small argument arose over someone using somebody else's towel or eating someone's yogurt, he wouldn't come in to make peace but would instead fuel the conflict by mocking one and berating the other. In the end, everyone wound up guilty. It gave him total control. I realized he wanted to stop us from uniting against him. Of course, he never admitted it outright, but the dark smirk he wore whenever we fought told me everything. Father constantly insisted we owed him our gratitude for the roof over our heads and the food on our plates. He said we were incapable of anything without him, that I, for example, would never get into the college I wanted if not for his pull, that Stas wouldn't find decent work without his connections, and that Mila should be grateful for every day she lived because she was a girl and would be lost without her family. I often argued, saying I wanted to achieve everything on my own, only to be met with his jeering laughter or belittling remarks. Sometimes he claimed that people like me never get anywhere because we're too soft. I put up with all this for a long time. When I was a student, I tried to spend as little time at home as possible, staying late at the library or wandering around the city. Even on returning, I'd rush to my room to avoid running into father or my brother. Stas always demanded something or picked a fight, telling me I had no spine for letting father control me. Yet he himself lived off father, taking his money and spending it on risky activities that often flirted with illegality. If he couldn't get the money he needed, he had no scruples about stealing from home. If it went badly for him, he'd come back and scream that father never gave him real opportunities, so it was father's fault. In the midst of this chaos, felt like a pale shadow barely hanging on, constantly under stress. Sometimes, when no one else was around, she would tell me she worried about me. I'd ask why she couldn't stop him since she was my mother, but she'd shake her head and quietly say my father never listened to anyone else. She begged me to keep my head down and not provoke him, because she couldn't face his fury. Hearing these excuses hurt me, and I couldn't help resenting her inaction. But I also understood she was broken long ago. I first seriously thought about running away from my family when my savings disappeared. I had been carefully saving money for a long time, depriving myself of small joys, so I could at least get out from under father's rule and rent a room. Then one day I realized a significant amount was missing. I suspected Stas since he was the only other person who could know about my hiding spot. I confronted him, but he told me not to dare accuse him. I showed him my evidence, and he exploded, shouting that I had no right to keep money in this house anyway, and anything I saved should go to the family fund. Then father appeared. I thought he would side with me and punish Stas. Instead, he claimed it was my fault for misplacing my money. Then he added that I should hand over any savings directly to him because only he knew how to spend it properly. I stood there, seething inside. I wanted to scream that it was unfair, but raising my voice would only make things worse. That moment I understood father was covering for Stas. Maybe Stas had promised him some form of payoff. I felt a deep humiliation. After that day, I promised myself never to keep money in that house again. And I noticed that Stas kept stealing not just from me but also from mother, like her gold earrings that were a family heirloom. When she saw they were gone, she didn't dare report it to father. He would have said it was all nonsense and that she never should have owned such trinkets. I watched my mother, realizing her own son was robbing her, but she was too scared of father to say a word. I wanted to run away from them all, never seeing those faces again. But I didn't have the resources to move out yet. I had no stable income, so all I could do was endure. Then came another family drama. Father decided the house needed renovation. He said we had to pour all our funds into it. He spent the savings we had and also took out a loan in mother's name. She didn't dare object. That put even more pressure on our finances. Money vanished, the renovation dragged on. Father was angry at everyone for not helping enough, and we were helpless. He demanded Stas do some labor, but Stas only pretended to help before disappearing again. I didn't have the skills or means to change anything. I thought our house was collapsing both physically and morally, and that no renovation would fix it. Mila had grown older and started vanishing from home more often. She told me not to ask where she went. I suspected she was drifting into questionable circles, searching for a glimpse of freedom. Sometimes she came back in the dead of night, creeping quietly to her room. I saw mother begging her to come home earlier, but Mila brushed her off, saying it was her life. As long as father didn't find out about her late nights, she avoided direct conflict. I pitied her, but in our family you learned not to ask for help. You were on your own. Eventually I tried a bold move. I got a side job that paid cash but kept it secret from father. I asked an acquaintance who owned a small shop if I could sweep up in the evenings for a little pay. He agreed as a favor, saying he didn't want any trouble. I showed up late, after closing, mopped floors, took out trash, sometimes helped unload goods, and got a bit of cash, which I stashed not at home but with that acquaintance. I told him about my family situation, and he agreed to hold on to the money. Months went by. I was often absent from home. I told father I was studying for exams or attending free courses across town. He mocked me, saying I'd amount to nothing anyway, but at least he didn't force me to stay home all day. One time he demanded I show him my progress, and I had to invent excuses. He seethed but let it drop, probably figuring I wasn't worth the trouble. Stas ran into yet another crisis. He'd fallen into more debt and couldn't repay it. He stole more valuables from the house, including an heirloom ring of mother's. Father was enraged, but to my shock, he didn't punish Stas harshly. He insisted that this was family business and had to be kept inside the family. That was when I saw father's true nature. Preserving a pristine public image mattered more than the moral safety of our household. He'd rather tolerate a thief under his roof than expose the family shame. Mila was barely around. I heard she told Mother she was sleeping at a friend's place. Mother tried to figure out what was going on, but Mila just shrugged. I avoided meddling because I knew she'd resent me. One evening, though, I saw bruises on her arm. I asked what happened, and she said it was none of my business. I offered help. She scoffed. I felt growing concern for her. But in our family, no one asked for help, and no one offered it openly. I kept saving money in secret, but I realized I needed not only funds but also a plan. Which path to take? Continuing my studies or working full-time? I knew that without an education I'd struggle, yet I couldn't stand living in that nightmare for years. One day, while carrying boxes in my friend's shop, he mentioned another friend who needed a warehouse worker. The pay was better than sweeping floors. I said I might be interested, but I worried that official documents might let Father track me down. Returning home that evening, I faced another shock. Father was in the kitchen with Stas. They were clearly having a tense talk. Stas was nervously smoking, even though he rarely did it at home, and Father was tapping his fingers on the table. When I entered, Father said I should stay and listen because the discussion concerned all of us. He explained he had gotten a letter or notice about Stas's large debts, now past due. Father stood up, saying Stas had to fix the problem because Father wouldn't pay it. Stas insisted he had nothing left to sell since he'd already taken half the valuables from home. Father told him to sell more because he refused to hand over any money. I tried to remain by the doorway, staying out of it. But Stas unexpectedly turned his focus onto me, telling Father not to forget that maybe I had some secret income. My heart sank. Did he know about my side job? I denied it, saying I had no idea what he meant. Stas pressed, claiming someone had seen me near that shop at night. I said I was just visiting a friend. Father told me not to lie, claiming he had grounds to suspect I'd been earning money behind his back. I stood there, trying to keep calm while I burned with anger inside. Father walked up closer, and I felt the weight of his glare. He said that if I'd done that, I was betraying the family, trying to fill my own pockets and run. I told him that wasn't true. I was merely helping a friend for free. Father didn't believe me. He said if he found out I was lying, I'd regret it. Then, almost snarling, he added that if Stas failed to solve his debt problem, Father would throw him out on the street and let him die there. I saw Stas's eyes flare with rage, but he had no reply. That moment was a turning point for me. I realized my secret was about to come out. If Stas kept digging, he might threaten my friend until he confessed, and all my savings would be gone. I understood I had to leave immediately, even though I didn't have enough money for a truly secure life. That was the night I decided to escape. I asked my friend if there was any cheap room to rent right away. He said a distant relative of his had a room at low cost, though the conditions were rough. I told him that was fine, that I was desperate. He asked if I had enough money. I said I'd take whatever I had. He returned all my little savings and promised to call his relative on my behalf. So in one evening, I prepared to flee, stuffing my essentials in a backpack. I felt like I was jumping into darkness, but I saw no other choice. I waited for Father and Stas to leave. Mother and Mila were occupied in other rooms, so I quietly slipped out. I didn't say goodbye or explain anything. If Father found out I was leaving, he might have physically stopped me. I stepped beyond the gate, a mix of fear and relief swirling inside me. When I got farther away, I breathed in deeply and realized everything was now in my hands. Yes, I had no real support network. Yes, I could go broke if I lost my job. But at least I was escaping constant dread. I moved into that tiny room. It was cramped, with peeling wallpaper and practically no heat, but I could lock the door and keep out everyone else. The landlady was an older woman who barely bothered me unless it was time to collect rent. I got a job at the warehouse run by my friend's acquaintance. The work was tough, but it paid a bit more than my shop job and I could save a little. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe without fear, though it wasn't easy. Sometimes I was exhausted, unable to sleep well in that cold little room. But I felt an enormous sense of relief. After a few weeks, Mila came to see me. I opened the door and found her standing there, looking down. She asked if she could come in for a bit. I let her in and we sat by my tiny table. She told me everything at home was awful. Father was furious about my escape, calling me a traitor, threatening to punish me if he found me. Meanwhile, Stas had grown even more aggressive, convinced I had a stash of money, furious I'd run off. Mila said she couldn't stand it anymore. Father had started checking her phone, telling her she was shaming the family, even showing up at her friends' places to see where she went at night. She told me she was desperate, nowhere else to go. I asked if any of her friends could take her in, but she said that would be too long, and nobody wanted to house her indefinitely. I glanced around my cramped room. I offered to let her stay for a few days, but she'd have to sleep on the floor. Mila said that was better than living under constant psychological pressure. Mixed feelings warred in me. I remembered how she refused to run away with me before, yet now she wanted help. Still, she was my sister. I said yes, she could share what little I had. She quietly thanked me. For several days, we lived together in that tiny space. I left early for the warehouse job while she stayed behind, supposedly hunting for a way out. I never pushed for details. Some nights I came back to find her sitting on the floor wrapped in a blanket, scrolling through her phone. I sensed her despair, not knowing where she could go. One night she began telling me about her boyfriend, who turned out to be as abusive as our father, which explained the bruises on her arm. I realized she was recreating our family dynamic, attracting a man just like him. It upset me, but I avoided lecturing her. On the third day of her stay, there was a sudden pounding at my door, much louder than the landlady's gentle knock, and Mila was still inside. I opened it warily and saw Stas. My heart sank. He told me to let him in if I didn't want any trouble. I sensed a confrontation brewing. He barged inside, saw Mila, and said he got it now. We'd run away from father together. I demanded he leave, but he just walked around, sneering at how poor my lodgings were. Then he demanded money. He insisted I had a secret stash. I answered I didn't, that all I had were my meager wages and rent money. He told me to prove it by handing over whatever I had. I knew if I gave in, he would keep coming back. So I tried to stand my ground, saying I would call the police if he didn't leave. He laughed, told me not to act tough because he knew I had no power or contacts, and threatened me. I realized he was right. Calling the police might cause me to lose my room, plus father would take revenge. But I was desperate. I told him I'd shout for help and involve the neighbors. He seemed unnerved by that possibility and stormed off, grabbing what little cash I had in my wallet on his way out. Mila said he was never satisfied. I cursed under my breath, aware this could happen again. Stas had made it clear he'd betray any of us for his own gain. And now he'd found me in my new hideout. I saw no long-term solution. If Mila stayed, he'd come again. But if she left, she'd be homeless. Finally, she announced she'd found another option. A friend who said she could stay with him. I asked who he was, and she just said someone she knew from her crowd. She insisted she didn't want to risk my safety any longer. I let it be her decision. The next morning she packed and left. I kept working and feeling paranoid that Stas might return. I even warned my warehouse bosses that a troublesome family member might show up. They promised to inform me but said they wouldn't fight him if he appeared. I realized I still might have to flee once more, maybe to a different city. Through acquaintances, I heard bits of news from home. Father was growing bitter and older. The renovation was never completed. Finances were a mess. Stas was still in debt, and mother was worn down by it all. Sometimes I felt guilty for leaving mother there, but I knew I couldn't save her by staying. Maybe one day, if I was on solid ground, I could help. Eventually, I met a woman named Elisa at the warehouse, where she worked in the office. She also had a rocky relationship with her relatives, which made it easy for us to connect. We started spending time together. I told her about my father's control and Stas's behavior. She was shocked at such toxicity, though she had her own family struggles. I trusted her more than I'd trusted anyone, because she seemed to genuinely understand. One day I told her I was thinking of leaving the city altogether, so my brother couldn't track me down. She surprised me by suggesting she'd been wanting a change too, maybe a new place. She mentioned her uncle had connections in another city that might help us get decent jobs. Maybe we could move there together. I hesitated, unsure if it was too risky. but I realized it might be my chance. We planned a short trip to scout the new city during our vacation from work. Once there, we saw it wasn't so bad. Starting from scratch is always hard, but it looked feasible. Elisa felt encouraged. When we returned, we decided to quit our warehouse jobs, giving notice so we could move within a month. Everything fell into place. I was almost at ease, but then Stas appeared again, apparently having watched me from a distance. He cornered me outside the warehouse at night, told me to come with him. I refused. He grabbed me, shoved me against a wall. Nobody was around to help at first. He demanded I pay him to leave me in peace. I told him I had nothing. He said he knew I was planning to move, so I must have money, and if I didn't give him some, he'd tell father or make my life hell in the new place. Rage flared up inside me. Enough was enough. I said I wouldn't give him a cent, nor did I fear him. He punched me in the cheek, sending pain through my skull. I staggered, tasting blood. Just then, 2 co-workers stepped out of the warehouse, running to help. Stas cursed and fled. They helped me inside, where I nursed my swelling face. I realized if my colleagues hadn't come, he might have beaten me badly. That night sealed my decision. I had to vanish as soon as possible. Elisa agreed and we rushed our plans. Within days we had our things packed. A couple of friends offered to drive us and our belongings. We left no forwarding address. I changed my phone number. Elisa said now we could start anew. In the new city we faced challenges. We had to rent a cramped room together. We found only modest work at first, but we could gradually save. For the first time, I no longer saw my father or brother, and the terror in my heart finally receded. I was learning to build a life from scratch, though sometimes I came home dead tired to a tiny, unheated place. Yet I felt calmer than ever. I cautiously got in touch with my mother, calling from a new number. Hearing her voice made me grip the phone so tight I nearly broke it. She spoke softly, saying she missed me and worried about me. I asked about her situation. Was father treating her badly? She said he was as nasty as ever, though he was aging and less physically strong. Meanwhile, Stas was still around, drifting in and out, borrowing money. Mila had mostly moved out, but sometimes visited. My mother admitted father hated that but couldn't stop her. I realized my sister had also escaped that house, at least partly. Mother told me she sometimes considered leaving too, maybe going to live with her own sister, but was scared. I offered to help if she ever found the courage. She thanked me through tears, and my heart twisted with guilt. I knew I couldn't force her to go. Father was still ranting about me being a traitor, saying he'd punish me if I ever set foot in that house again. I hung up, reminded again how deeply he resented me, attending evening classes to improve my skills, and eventually found a slightly better position. Elisa also got a better job, and soon we could afford our own small apartment. A sense of real freedom washed over me. We got to know our neighbors, had a social life, and for the first time in forever, I felt somewhat normal. Occasionally, I'd think about my mother. Maybe one day I'd help her get away from father, but only if she chose to go. Time passed, and Elisa and I grew closer. One day she suggested marriage, though she only brought it up gently, worried it might stress me. She asked if I wanted any relatives at the wedding. I admitted I didn't think so. My mother might come if she dared. Mila probably wouldn't, not wanting to revisit the trauma. Father and Stas were obviously out of the question. In the end, we decided on a simple ceremony with a few close friends. I told my mother about it, but she was too afraid to attend. She sent me a quiet message wishing me well. I appreciated the gesture while feeling sorry she couldn't share that day. Our wedding was humble, but I was happy that no toxic relatives were around. I felt a sting of sadness for my mother, but I tried to accept the reality. After the wedding, Elisa and I discussed the future, maybe having a child, finding a better apartment. I realized that in my new life, there was no place for my old family. But then fate tested me again. One day my phone rang, an unknown number. It was Mila. She said she wanted to see me, that nothing disastrous was happening. She just wanted to talk. We met at a small cafe. I was struck by how much older she looked. Her eyes carried a heaviness. She smiled, but with a bitter edge. She told me father was becoming more ill, though no kinder, and the house was basically falling apart. Mother was miserable. Stas kept drifting in and out, taking whatever he could. She said everyone was living in denial. She confessed she envied me for leaving and forging my own path. I asked if she'd try persuading Mother to leave. She said yes, but Mother was still too frightened of Father's wrath. I realized nothing had changed. Mila admitted she didn't know how to handle it, but she was grateful I showed her there was a way out. We parted on calm terms. I no longer resented her. Time had softened that bitterness. I went home and told Elisa about it. She said it was normal that people stuck in toxic families often can't break free right away. I agreed. At least I had done it. We had a peaceful evening meal, and I felt grateful for my decision. Though my memories of that house still lurked in my mind, the nightmares gradually faded. My mother texted that things were the same at home. Father was sick, still raging at Stas. I'd gotten used to living with that as background noise. We had a stable life now. Then one day came another call from Mother. Father was in the hospital in critical condition, possibly dying. She said he wanted to see all his children, that maybe he regretted his actions. My insides churned. Part of me felt it was only because he was desperate. Another part recognized he was still my father. I told her I needed time to think. She urged me not to take too long. I wrestled with it for days and ultimately decided not to go. Maybe some would call that cruel, but I felt I couldn't face the man who had been so cold and cruel all my life. Mila also chose not to go, saying she carried too much fear and hurt. Stas, according to Mother, had vanished again and couldn't be reached. So my mother was alone by his side. Not long after, she told me Father passed away without regaining consciousness. I felt no triumph, only sadness that it all ended this way. We were strangers to him. Only a couple of distant relatives and Mother attended the funeral. I stayed away. So did Mila. So did Stas. Perhaps we were heartless in others' eyes, but Father had destroyed our sense of a loving family. Mother told me he left debts in her name so she'd have to sell the house. I offered help, but she brushed it off, wanting to handle it herself. And so ended the era of my father, a man who loved to dominate and intimidate, dying alone. Life moved on. I kept working. Elisa thrived in her career, and we enjoyed our small circle of friends. Eventually we had a child. I promised myself never to be like my father. Our home would be safe and loving. Elisa agreed. As our child grew, we communicated openly, explaining rather than dictating. I understood how vital it was not to repeat my father's cycle. If anything, my painful past taught me empathy and made me value mutual respect. I knew how important it is not to raise your children in fear and distrust. I occasionally phoned Mother. She'd finally moved in with her sister. She seemed calmer. Stas showed up sometimes, telling her he was leaving to find a job somewhere, but I avoided contacting him. I had no desire to see him again. I'd left that world behind. Over time, the memories of a house filled with manipulation and anger no longer crushed me. I learned to recall my past without searing pain. I was free. I had Elisa, and we had a child in a home free of insults or stolen possessions. Sometimes I'd dream about returning to that house, seeing Father in the living room, telling me to come to him, only to start yelling about how I betrayed him. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, but then remember I was far away and he was gone. As more time passed, I felt less bitterness. I realized one person, my father, had held so much power over an entire family, planting fear and hatred, training us to lie and manipulate, all to preserve his own authority. We even called that a family. I had to make the difficult choice to leave it all behind, effectively abandoning my mother and siblings to avoid losing myself. I have no regrets because I knew staying would have destroyed me. Maybe I would have ended up just like him, cold and controlling, perpetuating the same cycle. Thankfully, I escaped. Now I focus on what I've gained rather than what I lost. The chance to shape my life, choose whom I associate with, and how to treat them. The chance to build my own family that doesn't revolve around fear or force. I like to think the world, for all its cruelty, still grants us a path out of any cage if we're determined. Whenever I see Elisa's smile or hear our child laugh and run into my arms, I know every hardship was worth it. I preserved myself. I found my place, where I'm no longer haunted by endless threats or manipulation. That is my personal victory over the shadows of my past.